What would you sacrifice to survive? For two sisters, the answer was their last shred of childhood. Before we unravel this emotional story, comment below, where in the world are you watching from? Subscribe and turn on notification. The twins walked slowly, their footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement as they made their way to the vendor's cart. Their stomachs growled, a constant reminder of the hunger that had taken root deep inside them. Emma's hand clutched West's tightly, trying to offer the smallest comfort. But even she knew the weight of the day was too heavy for either of them to carry alone. Their faces were drawn, pale from lack of food, their eyes dimmed by the hardships they had endured. The stuffed bear, now an almost lifeless reminder of a forgotten time, was the only thing they had left to cling to. They had played with it for years, fighting over it like any other child would. But now, it was more than just a toy. It was the last thread between them and survival. The vendor's cart was just up ahead, its bright fruit and snacks a stark contrast to the greyness around them. The smell of fresh produce, of ripe fruit, was a cruel reminder of what they no longer had access to. They stopped in front of the cart, but the nervousness in their steps was unmistakable. Their voices were soft, barely above a whisper as they approached the vendor, offering the stuffed bear with hands that shook not just from the cold, but from fear. The vendor was busy sorting through his wares, not paying them much attention at first. But when they spoke, he paused, his face scrunching up as he glanced at the ragged bear in Emma's hand. The girls, their heads down, spoke quietly, almost apologetically. They had no money. But they had this, a childhood treasure, something that had once been loved. The vendor shook his head, his lips curling into a disinterested frown. "I can't take this," he muttered, eyes quickly moving away from the bear. "It's just a toy, lady. I don't deal in stuff like this." Emma tried again, her voice even quieter, as though the words themselves might shatter. But it didn't matter. The vendor waved them off, dismissing them with a dismissive hand. "Go on. There's nothing here for you." West's face flushed, her heart sinking. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it didn't help. Emma's eyes were full of shame, her grip tightening on the bear, but even she knew this was their only chance. But the vendor wasn't interested. He wasn't even looking at them anymore. He had turned back to his fruit, his indifference too much to bear. The twins stood there for a moment, frozen, unable to believe that even their last possession wasn't worth anything. The harsh reality set in with a weight that nearly crushed them. But they couldn't give up, not yet. They turned away, their hands still tightly clutching the stuffed bear. Meanwhile, Richard Bennett, still not far from the vendor's cart, had been walking aimlessly. He was tired of the world of business, tired of the endless meetings, the deals that didn't excite him anymore. His life, once filled with purpose and drive, had now become an unending cycle of wealth and success that brought him nothing of real value. He was surrounded by luxury, by the finest things money could buy, but none of it had filled the emptiness he felt inside. His every step was heavy, weighed down by the hollow feeling he carried within him, the realization that despite all he had, something crucial was missing. As he walked down the sidewalk, his thoughts drifted. Was this all there was to life? Was success nothing more than empty victory? He could never seem to answer that question, no matter how many times he asked it. When he passed the vendor's cart, he saw the twins. He almost didn't stop, but something about them made him pause. There was a quiet desperation in their demeanor that stirred something in him, something he couldn't ignore. He slowed his pace, drawn to them without understanding why. It wasn't just the sight of the stuffed bear, it was their posture, their fear, their struggle. Richard watched as the vendor turned them away. The twins stood there, small and vulnerable, unable to do anything more than hold on to their last possession. The vendor barely spared them a glance as he went back to his work. His actions were quick and dismissive, the girls no more than an inconvenience. But to Richard, it wasn't just a simple refusal. It felt like something deeper, something wrong. He could walk away. He should walk away. This wasn't his problem. He was wealthy, successful, he had worked hard for everything he had. He had earned his place in the world. So why should he care about two girls, one toy, and a vendor who couldn't spare a moment of kindness. But then, something inside him shifted. The twins' hands trembled as they held the bear, their small fingers struggling to keep it together, just like their world. Richard couldn't look away. His mind raced, thoughts darting in every direction. He had everything anyone could want. But here, in this small moment, in the quiet desperation of these two young girls, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time, a reflection of something he had lost: humanity. The vendor's refusal lingered in the air, a heavy silence settling over the moment. Richard felt a stirring in his chest, a pull he couldn't explain. He had everything, yet he was disconnected from the world. He had never thought of those less fortunate as anything other than people to pity, or perhaps worse, people who simply hadn't worked hard enough. But here, before him, were two sisters who had nothing but their bond, their hope, and their last piece of childhood to cling to. Richard was standing there, frozen in place, the thoughts racing in his head. What if I just turn around and keep walking? What if I leave this to someone else? They'll figure it out on their own. But no. This wasn't like anything he had ever experienced before. He felt something inside him stirring, like a faint pulse in a world he had closed off long ago. Should I step in? Should I help them? His eye shifted from the girls back to the vendor, then back to the twins. He was at a crossroads, and in that split second, he knew his life was about to change. Would he continue to live in his own bubble of luxury, detached from the real world? Or would he step into the messiness of life, to help these girls, to make a choice that might shift something deep within him? The question hung in the air as Richard took a single, steady step toward the girls. His thoughts slowed, his heart beating a little faster. What would he do? Richard took another step forward, his body moving before his mind could catch up. The cold air cut through his suit, but it didn't matter. He was no longer aware of the city, of the rushing cars, or the towering buildings. All that mattered was the moment unfolding before him, the moment that would change everything. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded louder than anything he'd ever felt. How much for the toy? He asked, his eyes locked on the vendor. The vendor looked at Richard, clearly confused. The toy? What do you mean? It's just an old thing. I can't. His voice trailed off, not understanding why Richard would even ask. His eyes flicked from the toy to Richard's face, and then to the twins, who were still standing there, clutching the bear. Richard's eyes didn't leave the vendor. He reached into his pocket, his hand moving with purpose. How much for it? His voice was quieter now, insistent. There was no hesitation, no questioning of the absurdity. It wasn't about the toy. It was about the girls. It was about something deeper than he had ever understood. The vendor, still unsure, scratched his head. Well, I don't really know, man. I guess I could, but Richard cut him off. I'll pay whatever it is, Richard said, pulling out a handful of bills and placing them in the vendor's hand. The vendor blinked at the money, his surprise evident. Just give them some food. Whatever they want, Richard added, the words coming out with a force he hadn't known he was capable of. The vendor's eyes widened, the realization dawning on him. He looked at the money in his hand, at Richard, and then at the twins. His gaze softened, and for the first time, he nodded. All right, all right. Take whatever you want, he said, stepping aside to make room for the girls. The twins stood frozen, staring at the scene unfolding before them. They had no idea who this man was or why he was doing this. They had seen kindness before, but nothing like this. They had only known rejection, only known struggle. But this was different. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at West, who was still clutching the stuffed bear, as if afraid it might slip away from her fingers. They looked at Richard, the stranger, whose generosity was something they had never experienced. And then, with tentative hands, they reached out. The vendor, now moved by the sight of the twins, handed them a small bag filled with fruit, bread, and a bottle of water. The sound of the bag crinkling filled the air, as if marking the beginning of something they had longed for. A tiny spark of hope. West's eyes were wide, her lips trembling. She could barely speak. "Tea, thank you," she whispered, her voice small but full of gratitude. Emma, still in shock, nodded silently, her hand gripping the bag tightly. Her fingers trembled, and she couldn't seem to stop staring at the food. It felt unreal, like a dream. Richard stood there, watching them. The moment felt heavier now. His chest ached with something he couldn't quite place, something that had been missing in his life for far too long. He looked at the twins, their faces softening with relief, and he felt a pang of something he couldn't ignore, something human, something that made him realize how empty his own world had become. The twins' eyes met his for a fleeting moment. Emma's gaze was full of wonder, but there was also an unspoken question in it. Why? Why was he doing this for us? Richard didn't have an answer. Not yet. But somehow, in that moment, the question didn't matter. They slowly turned away from the vendor, their hands clutching the bag tightly. The stuffed bear, once a symbol of their struggle, was left behind on the ground, forgotten for now. They didn't need it anymore. Not with food in their hands, not with the weight of the day lifting from their shoulders. Richard watched them walk away, their small, tired figures shrinking as they disappeared into the crowd. A strange peace settled over him, but it wasn't the kind he had expected. It wasn't the peace of success, of a life built on hard work and wealth. No, this was different. This was the peace of giving, of making a real difference, even if just for a moment. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought, until the vendor's voice broke the silence. "You sure about that?" the vendor asked, a hint of awe in his tone. "I mean, that was a lot of cash for a stuffed bear." Richard turned to look at him, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at the ground where the toy had been left. It wasn't about the bear. It was about something much larger. Something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until now. He nodded slowly, still deep in thought. "Yeah, I'm sure." As Richard walked away, the weight in his chest was gone. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. He had stepped into someone else's life, even if just for a moment. And in doing so, he had found something more valuable than all the wealth in the world. The day had been a turning point, not just for the twins, but for him too. If this moment has your heart racing, tell us in the comments, what would you have done? The crowd around the vendor's cart had been quiet, watching the strange exchange between Richard and the girls. As Richard turned to walk away, heads turned, whispers passed from one person to the next. Some people were unsure of what they had just witnessed. Why a wealthy man, a man whose world had seemed so far removed from the struggles of others, would suddenly intervene in such a simple yet profound way? The vendor stood in stunned silence, his eyes still fixed on the money Richard had handed him. He didn't know what to say, his mind struggling to make sense of the scene. The usual exchange, the simple trade of goods, had turned into something much deeper. Something that felt more like a moment of grace than a mere transaction. For the vendor, it was a quiet realization that the world wasn't always as cold as he thought, that sometimes, in the smallest acts, there was a flicker of something better. Meanwhile, the twins, their faces still full of disbelief, sat down on the sidewalk with their precious bag of food. The crinkling of the plastic bag was almost too much to bear as they pulled out the bread, fruit, and water. Their hands, still trembling, tore into the food with a hunger that had been building for days, weeks even. Their eyes widened with each bite, as though they had forgotten what it felt like to be full, to feel nourished not just in body but in spirit. As they devoured the food, they exchanged silent glances. Their earlier fears, their hunger, the desperation they had carried, were all beginning to fade with each bite. It wasn't just the food that was filling them, but the sudden, unexpected kindness they had received. They had known nothing but struggle, and yet, here they were, their stomachs full and their hearts a little lighter. Richard's footsteps echoed as he walked away from the cart, the weight of the moment still pressing on him. He had never felt so alive, yet so unsettled. Before, he had only felt the emptiness of his success, the hollow feeling that had driven him to keep chasing more. But now, something had shifted. The encounter with the twins had awakened something inside him, something he didn't know was missing. He didn't feel the need to justify it, to explain why he had done it. He didn't even need to know what would happen next. But in that moment, for the first time in what felt like years, Richard felt connected. Connected to something larger than his wealth, his empire, his endless pursuits. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew it was a beginning. Time passed, and the city's pace never slowed. But Richard's life had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. He began to think about the world beyond his high-rise office, beyond his meetings and boardrooms. The money he had once poured into investments now found its way into something different: shelters for families, for children, for those who had nowhere to turn. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't a perfect solution. But it was a start. Richard was careful, methodical. He couldn't fix everything, and he didn't pretend he could. The process was slow, and he learned just how complex the issues of poverty and homelessness were. But he persisted, building relationships with local organizations, listening to stories he had never taken the time to hear before. He began funding shelters, food programs, and support systems that helped those in need get back on their feet. But it wasn't a clean, perfect solution. The problems were bigger than any one person could solve. Richard's internal struggle continued. He still felt the emptiness at times, the longing for something more. But he no longer believed that wealth alone could fill it. He understood now that it was purpose, connection, and giving that could heal what was broken inside him. As for Emma and West, their lives didn't change overnight. The food they had received that day wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the struggles they had lived through, the hardship they faced every day. But the simple kindness had planted a seed, something that would grow into a brighter future for them. They would still have to fight for their place in the world, to rise above their circumstances. But, for the first time, they had hope, a hope that maybe the world could be kinder than they had ever known. The stuffed bear, the last symbol of their childhood, remained with them, though it wasn't the same as it once had been. The toy, once a source of comfort, was now a reminder of how far they had come. It was no longer just a faded object. It was a symbol of lost innocence, of the times they had endured. Yet, in the same breath, it was a symbol of unexpected hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were acts of kindness that could change everything. For Richard, the bear became a quiet reminder, too. A reminder of what he had lost, and what he had gained in return. It wasn't about the money, the power, or the wealth. It was about the small things, those moments of connection that made him feel human again. The city moved on. People continued to go about their lives, unaware of the changes that had unfolded in the shadows. But Richard knew, and Emma and Wes knew, that nothing would ever be the same again. They had been touched by a moment of kindness that rippled out far beyond that afternoon. It wasn't the kind of ending one might expect. There were no grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Just small, quiet acts that set something in motion. The journey wasn't over for Richard, and it wasn't over for the twins. Life would continue, with its struggles and its victories, but now, there was something else, a connection, a hope, a shared understanding that had never existed before. And in that, there was a quiet peace, a reminder that even the smallest acts could change the world in ways no one could predict. When was the last time you gave more than you took? It's easy to get lost in our own world, focused on what we need, what we want, and what we think we deserve. We chase success, accumulate wealth, and sometimes forget that true fulfillment doesn't come from what we have, but from what we give. Richard's transformation wasn't about changing his wealth or his status, it was about a shift in perspective. For the first time, he saw beyond his own desires and saw the lives of others. He stepped out of his comfort zone and gave something without expecting anything in return. And in that moment, his life began to change in ways that went beyond money or achievement. This story reminds us of something universal, that empathy, kindness, and genuine connection are the true measures of success. When we look beyond ourselves, when we open our hearts to others, we see the world not through the lens of what we can take, but through what we can give. It doesn't always have to be grand. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes, it's the smallest act, the gesture that may seem insignificant to us, that makes the biggest difference to someone else. As we reflect on Richard's journey, we're reminded that giving isn't about charity, it's about understanding, about recognizing the humanity in others, and seeing our shared experiences. It's about offering a piece of ourselves, however small, and watching it ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully see. The true power of kindness lies in its ability to transform not just the one who receives, but the one who gives. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that kindness changes worlds. And subscribe, our next tale might just change yours.